Hello and welcome to The Exchange. I'm Dianne Buckner. Two separate warnings out today for Canadian homeowners. They echo what others around the world have cautioned. The country's largest real estate markets are frothy. And if those bubbles burst, the effect on Canada's youngest homeowners would be devastating. The first comes from an international voice, the OECD. It says Canada's new government should take steps to contain financial stability risks from high household debt and house prices. It raises specific alarms about Toronto. There, newly completed but empty condo units have soared, increasing the risk of a sharp market correction. The second warning is from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. It imagines a scenario in which there is a 20% correction in the housing market. 1 in 10 homeowners in their 20s and 30s would be underwater, meaning they'd owe more than they own. That's 169,000 families. On average, their net worth would drop by up to 45% or $60,000. The report's author concludes the deleveraging of the household sector should be a priority for governments. Lessons learned during the U.S. real estate crisis may be helpful in Canada. The CCPA joins a long list of bodies who say this market is overvalued. There are modest estimations from TD Bank, the IMF, the Bank of Canada, and Fitch Ratings Agency, as well as more severe calculations from The Economist magazine and Deutsche Bank. David McDonald is a senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. So, David, first of all, why did you go with the 20% correction in these calculations?
Well, I looked at 9 different analysts' estimates of what we could see as a potential downside in Canada, and 20% was the mid-range. So there are some that are more pessimistic, some that are more optimistic, and this is in the middle.
And did you calculate the chances of this kind of a decrease happening?
That's not what this report looks at per se, and I actually think that in the short to medium term, low mortgage rates may well make the situation as we see it today sustainable, at least in the short term. In Toronto and Vancouver, those low mortgage rates make it easy to stay in big mortgages, and that's certainly what we're seeing young Canadians taking on.
All right, and now this concept of being underwater, of owing more than possibly what the property is worth, am I describing that the way you see it as well?
Yep, absolutely. Assets worth less than debts.
And I mean, that's really only an issue, though, when you sell, right? I mean, it's sort of a paper loss until you sell. And I'm thinking about a lot of these young families are not buying a house because they're making an investment or planning to flip it or whatever. They're hoping to live there for a long time. So how significant is the fact that the property is losing some value?
Well, it can be a problem as well if you're trying to renew your mortgage and you're underwater. It can make it problematic to refinance your mortgage. That being said, that you're absolutely right. If you hold these assets for long enough, hopefully the value will return. Now, some of the impact I think that's most important is the psychological impact of homeowners realizing that they're underwater, they have big debts, their house value has come down. And so therefore, instead of spending in the economy on, say, home renovations or buying a car or going out to dinner, they focus on debt repayment and deleveraging, which can have a big impact on the Canadian economy as a whole, which, as we're seeing, is relatively slow growth so far. And I think one of the big drawbacks in the future will likely be young homeowners deciding not to spend in the economy because they've got to pay back these big debts.
And now, when you were looking at this, were you looking at the different markets? Because we always end up talking about Toronto and Vancouver as being the places where real estate values are just crazy out of whack. I'm wondering if this situation you're describing will be widespread across the country. Do you see it that way, or do you see it really centered in these big urban centers where prices have become so high?
Well, you're right to point out that these are the Canadian averages based on the survey that I was using. There is some regional data in the survey that I looked at to some degree, and I think there's some evidence to suggest the situation would certainly be worse in British Columbia, Alberta, and Ontario. But the sample size was a bit small, so that's hard to say. But I think intuitively, the places where you're seeing the highest leverage ratios, that's say the young families taking on the most debts, are the places that are going to be hit hardest by declines in real estate prices. And so that high leverage hits much harder in those big markets. So this idea of 1 in 10 households being underwater nationally, that figure may be a lot higher in high-flying cities like Vancouver, Toronto, Calgary, where you've got to take on a much bigger mortgage to get into that same house compared to someplace like Windsor, for instance.
Now, who are you hoping is going to notice your work here and do something about it?
Well, I think the first thing we need to recognize is that the distributional impacts are not the same based on age groups. There are certain age groups that will be hit much harder than other age groups. And so it's useful to know who's going to be hit hardest if we do see a decline in real estate prices. The second thing I think that's worth looking at is that there are some instructive programs that were created in the United States during their real estate crisis that may well be useful in terms of importing into our real estate market if and when we do see a decline in real estate prices. So,
such as what?
Well, programs like HAMP and HARP, there's acronym programs, but in the U.S. what they allowed homeowners to do was to offset some of the big declines in real estate prices. So if you're unemployed for a couple of months, allow you to skip a couple payments on your mortgage. If you're underwater, allow you to refinance despite the fact that you are underwater. And if you lost your job or house prices declined, you couldn't make the payments anymore. One of the things that some of the U.S. programs allowed you to do was walk away from houses in the U.S. without a complete bankruptcy, so have a more restricted impact on your credit score to help you restart. And those are the types of programs that may well be necessary in Canada. Now, this isn't imminent, but I think in the longer term it's worth looking at some of these programs in the U.S.
I'm just curious, I mean, the prices are so high for houses just about everywhere. I'm sure anyone anywhere in Canada would say, oh, why is real estate so expensive? So, I mean, what's the option? Are you suggesting people should just rent and not even try and get into the market?
Well, certainly it's a difficult situation for young homeowners. Despite the fact that housing prices are very high and you got to take out big mortgages, mortgage rates are very low, and so the monthly payment may well be very affordable despite the fact that you've got a record high mortgage on a record high valuation of a house. And so you're in a real pickle if you're in your young years trying to get into the housing market, in the sense that you'll likely have to take on this big mortgage, but you can make the monthly payments for now. And so I think one of the things to recognize is that you should try as much as possible to deleverage, that is to say pay down that mortgage as quickly as possible in the hopes that you can take advantage of the low interest rates today, pull down that mortgage and not be over leveraged if and when housing prices do fall.
All right, well, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.